Okay, I think we can start if that works for everyone. I'll put us into the webinar session. Well, welcome everyone. Um, it's great to be here, and thanks for joining us at today's webinar, which is in conversation with civil society, the future of multilateralism, empowering youth. So thank you all for joining us. My name is Samuel, and I'm excited to moderate this conversation. I work with Civicus, and I'm also part of the Insured project. So before we dive into the webinar, let me just briefly introduce you to the Insured project and the reasoning behind the webinar. So Insured is a research consortium studying how the EU and its member states can better defend multilateralism and make global governance more robust, effective, and democratic. Its research assesses the state of play in different areas and investigates the EU and other international actors' strengths and weaknesses with the goal of defending and transforming multilateralism. So, as part of this project, we've organized a webinar series that connects the Insured project's academic research with civil society practice and practitioners. And we're trying to translate these cutting edge research findings into practical strategies and concrete guidance for organizations working to reform global governance systems in key policy areas. So this is the seventh and final installment of this series, focusing on youth participation across various areas of global governance. So young people will inherit the consequences of decisions being made in all these multilateral institutions, from the UN to NATO to the EU and many more. But their voices are often sidelined in global governance. Youth-led organizations can bring a sense of urgency and fresh ideas, which is much needed in international decision making. And so bringing youth perspectives into multilateral governance is also necessary if these institutions are going to remain relevant and effective in tackling the most important problems that will come and that will continue to play out over the coming years, right? So today we have a great panel of experts to discuss these issues. So I'm really pleased to introduce, firstly, Emily Wegener, who is the Senior Policy Officer at Transparency International Defense and Security. Emily's been actively involved and engaged with various multilateral processes, such as the UN's Convention Against Corruption, the Summit for the Future, the Peace Building Architecture, and also with the European Union and NATO. She's an advocacy and policy professional across defense, security, and global health policy spaces. And she's currently working on building better defense governance systems through stronger transparency, accountability, and anti-corruption safeguards. So thank you for joining us, Emily. And then we have Oni Papa, who is an advocate for participatory processes for young people in climate action and democratic governance. She serves as the Global Communications Co-Lead for the UN Environment's Program's Children and Youth Major Group, and also is the Program Manager for the Asia region at the International Federation of Liberal Youth. Oni's background includes serving as a member of UNICEF's Young People's Action Team, now continues as a youth mentor with UNICEF East Asia and Pacific. And Oni is also the co-founder of Kilos Co-Youth, one of the largest youth-run CSOs in the Philippines. And then last but not least, Prathit Singh, who will be joining us very soon, who is the Program Officer on Youth and Democracy at Interpeace, as well as the Project Coordinator and English Language Editor of the Geneva Policy Outlook. Prathit is also on the International Advisory Board for the Institute of Inspiring Children's Futures, and Prathit holds a master's degree in development studies, specializing in human rights and humanitarianism. And he's also a youth advocate for children and youth rights, and brings professional experience from working with various organizations, including the United Nations Development Programme. So we've got a great panel today, and we'll now proceed with the conversation, which will consist of various questions and interactions among the panelists. The webinar will be recorded and made available soon on Civicus's YouTube channel. as well as on the Insured website. So in case you missed something or you want to share it with colleagues, you can easily refer to it later. And then we'll finish off with a Q&A, so participants can send off their questions, putting them in the chat, and we can come to them later. So let's begin then with the questionnaire. So the first section of the questions will be focusing on what is youth participation exactly in the context of multilateral organizations. So to kick us off, let's start with Emily. So what do you see as being meaningful youth participation in the context of multilateral institutions? In your experience, do young people have decision-making power in these institutions?
Yes, thank you, Samuel. Thank you in general for Civicus for having me and for convening this conversation, which I think is very important. I'm very glad to be here today. I think young people have a highly valuable and important role to play in multilateral decision making because, as you said, they are the ones who will be most affected by decision making that is forward looking. And I think that's something that's recognized broadly, but not always significantly acted upon. And I think especially at the moment, we are seeing an emerging credibility gap with younger generations. So there's a visible decline in trust in multilateral institutions, in their effectiveness, but also in their relevancy amongst younger generations. And I can say that also from personal experience, sort of amongst peers, but also survey data also seems to reflect that. And I think meaningful inclusion is a key way to counteract that. If multilateral institutions across the board want to retain relevancy and legitimacy over time, I think so. Meaningful youth participation. I mean, what does that mean? I think it needs to move from token gestures, like including a youth speaker on a plenary, which is, it's a good step, it's a first step, but it's not enough to really hear and also include youth voices. Or, for example, consulting youth stakeholders at one point in a policy planning process, or even having Hello Kitty deliver an opening message at the Summit of the Future, which I found a very interesting approach to youth inclusion. So it needs to move beyond sort of more tokenistic gestures to a real structural and also sort of decision relevant involvement. And I think that other speakers will also have some insights to share on how this can look like. But I think, yeah, some examples would be representation in governance structures, so having youth representatives on governing boards, or also allowing youth representatives to join consultations or negotiations on, for example, resolutions to, like, this is what I've observed attending the UNCAC conference of the states parties. So there will be negotiations on resolutions to the treaty, which are in general closed to the public, but there is a possibility for governments to include civil society delegates in their delegation, and there you could also have a focus on youth delegates, for example, joining. But even I think there are wider things that can be done that are maybe not as direct, but even JPO programs or YPP programs, I think, are a step towards including young people in multilateral institution decision making. And I think something that I've really observed from having worked between peace building, conflict prevention, but also good governance, and then again defense and security spaces, is that it really depends what is defined as youth inclusion, but also how this is sort of conducted between policy areas. So I think in the peace building space, there are some good examples, and I can touch on that also later during the session in more detail on how young people and young peace builders can be included. I think the UNODC, which is an organization due to their anti-corruption mandate that we work quite closely with, has several youth-focused initiatives and also youth empowerment strategy. But then looking at the defense and security sector, which is in general a field where change happens very top down. So there's less emphasis on civil society engagement in general. There's less space for that. I think there's still a long way to go in including young people and hearing their voices, which it is being done. NATO does have a youth summit and they have youth engagement opportunities, but it's not as structural, and there's not that much in general of an emphasis on dialogue with civil society, but especially also with young people. And I think now, given that, military spending is increasing and also defense and security is playing a bigger role in public life again, and it's young people who are a huge stakeholder in this, I think there's a lot of work to do to actually include young people also in this sector. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that's I'm looking forward to hearing more about the specific areas that you worked in. But let's also move the conversation towards you, Honey. So, given that you've worked both within UN processes and grassroots youth movements, do you think there's a gap between participation opportunities that institutions offer for young people and the influence that they actually have?
Thanks for the question, Samuel, and thanks, Emily, for the amazing opening. And everyone's probably heard this from many other youth leaders, but tokenism is present in nearly all levels of institutions. Young people are often invited to speak or were consulted in side events, photographed in high-level events, asked to share, the youth perspective, the youth take on it. But the question we should continue asking is, after the speaking portion, which is fabulous, what changes? Who's taking notes, who's carrying it into the actual negotiation rooms, who's reporting back to us, who is accountable when sometimes inevitably our recommendations are ignored. I started working at 16 years old as a community organizer, so that was my first foray into development. I work with my local government unit on a triple integration project we produced we produced a short documentary and a theater play program for children in conflict with the law, which is a fascinating topic, if in any case some people are interested in that. But this experience specifically taught me something really important, like as a 16-year-old, that young people are absolutely capable of operating past being beneficiaries. We can produce knowledge. We can produce. We can shape narratives. Engage communities that are much broader, and things that are much bigger than us in ways that are deeply grounded in our local context and live realities. And I will say, to this day, I credit that as my first and foremost impactful example of youth-powered development. I'm, of course, not 16 anymore. I've worked in national governance. I've also had the absolute luck of co-founding a civil society organization. And 4 years ago, I began my work in global diplomacy and philanthropy, which I'm very lucky to have done so as well. And across these spaces, I have seen the same pattern repeat itself. Institutions are becoming better and better at creating these fabulous entry points for young people. And it is categorically good, great even. There are youth consultations, youth advisory groups, panels, statements, youth envoys, representation across this and that and this and that. These are important, and we do not want to dismiss them, and we aren't. Many of us worked hard as well to open those doors for other young people. But I will say access is not the same as power, as influence. A young person being in the room does not automatically mean that young people have influence. A bilateral meeting with this and that and this and that, a youth statement being delivered, consultation on this and that, on this research and that resolution. None of those mean automatically that the institution listened or that our inputs are reflected in what comes after. So the real gap is not necessarily about whether young people are present. It is about if the participation has consequences. So an example of that is young people need to be involved early enough to shape the agenda, you know, and not at the end to just validate these decisions that have already been made. And we're asked, what do you think about it? What can we do better? It's not a survey. A consultation is a consultation. It's not a survey. If young people are brought in only after the opportunities, yeah, after the opportunity is there, the priorities have already been set, the budget has been deliberated, the language has already been, pre-written, then our participation is decorative. It's not enough to say youth are welcome if the process is full of, well, technical language, inaccessible timelines, unpaid labor, visa barriers, meetings that only, and if we're being candid, well-resourced young people can afford to attend. And of course, there's the glaring, almost cynical matter of accountability. And I say this with the absolute amount of care because I work with people inside institutions who genuinely want to do better. So the problem is not bad faith. Sometimes the problem is structure. So many institutions are built to consult young people, but not necessarily to share power with them. If institutions ask young people for recommendations, they should also explain what was taken forward, what wasn't, why not. Otherwise, consultations can become extractive. They take our stories, they take our legitimacy, they take our grassroots perspectives, but they're not willing to share decision-making power. And I think that's something that definitely has to change, because in development, young people are not just a symbolic group. We are workers, organizers, we're regular people. We're also researchers, we're students, caregivers, we drive the economy, and we are also not a single voice. So youth participation has to recognize differences in class, geography, gender, disability, language, settings of conflict. Not everyone is safe to participate within their own context. Migration status, especially, and access to resources. So to just round it out, Samuel, there is a gap, yes. And the challenge for institutions is not whether they can make space for young people, because they already know how to do that. The real challenge is whether they are willing to let that space change the institution itself. And I really, truly want to believe that that is 100% possible.
Well, thank you so much, Ani, for your intervention, which has left me with a lot to think about. I think access is not the same as power is a crucial point. And I mean, in all these institutions, you can see that power is concentrated, especially within states, and especially the most powerful states. And also another fact that youth is not a monolith, that there's a wide variety of different groups of people who are youth. And so it's important to recognize that as well. So let's think now a little bit about moving on to you again, Emily. How can multilateral institutions be required to become more responsive to youth interests in their decision making?
Yes, thanks, Samuel, for the question. And I think, firstly, I really need to echo what Oni just said in terms of, yeah, access is not the same as power. It's very, very true, I think. And that's also tying in with your question very well in terms of requiring institutions to actually act on the inputs that young people are giving to them. Because I think a lot of the time, it can feel a bit like a tick box exercise. We're inviting young people to this consultation, or we're even hosting a youth summit, or we're doing this and that. And then there's a declaration, there's an outcome document that young people essentially write themselves, contribute their ideas to, share their experiences to create. And as Oni said, these experiences aren't always easy and not always easy to share. And then a lot of the time we don't really see these recommendations or declarations or whatever the outcome is of these convenings going anywhere. And I think that's where really accountability can be increased. And there also needs to be more transparency on when we are meeting and creating these outcome documents, who is this going to be shared with? What is the pathway? What is this feeding into, and how can we track if this is actually being considered? And yeah, if not, then why not? I think this is a crucial step. And then I think also in terms of access, and speaking from experience of engaging with some UN processes, especially, I think one thing that is not considered enough is how hard it actually is for CSOs, especially grassroots CSOs, to participate in a lot of UN processes and conferences and so on, because the application for the ECOSOC status, the ECOSOC consultative status that civil society organizations can acquire, which gives them a lot more access, easier access to conferences, to do side events, but also to submit written contributions to specific processes, is very long, is quite resource intensive, it's time intensive. There are other sort of difficulties around the criteria that you need to meet to get ECOSOC status. And then, for example, as Transparency International, we are quite decentralized movement, which is really great. So we have national chapters, which are their own NGOs essentially, and then they get accreditation as part of the TI movement, but they have their own funding, they have their own legal status and so on. So all of these NGOs, well, all of these chapters need to apply for ECOSOC status then on their own. So there's just, yeah, that is one huge barrier. And then also the ability to really set the agenda or influence the agenda of major events is also very limited. So a lot of the time to even do a side event, you need a state sponsor, so a government sponsoring, supporting your event, being part of your event. You need a multilateral institution to be involved. And I do understand the value of multi-stakeholder approaches, but I think it makes it difficult for civil society organizations, for example, operating in spaces where civic space is restricted and where, you know, there's no hope of them cooperating with their government, getting state sponsorship from their own country, or even where it can get them into danger, aligning themselves with foreign governments, thinking of foreign agent laws and so on. And also, you know, it's also a matter of connectivity. Not everyone has this access to multilateral institutions, to governments, and that is how you get very easily shut out of these processes. And I think that's in general an issue for civil society, but those issues are then compounded for youth organizations and grassroots organizations and yeah, those that don't have the resources and the connections to participate. So yeah, I think if multilateral institutions like the UN want to become more inclusive, a first step would be to take a look at these barriers that are put in place for civil society participation in general, and then take a good look at how these tend to favor larger, better connected NGOs based in countries with strong civil society and open civic space, and also tend to create more barriers for youth organizations, and then see how maybe these can be restructured or, you know, remodeled to be fairer and more inclusive. That's also something I'd say.
Thanks very much, Emily. Yeah, I think that your points were really crucial, and it leads us really nicely onto the barriers that young people and young youth organizations face, and civil society as well. And so this was the next section of the conversation. So I think we should move on to those, talking a bit more about those barriers in a bit more depth. So I'm going to move back onto you, Oni, in terms of the resources and access barriers that are significant for youth organizations, especially those from the Global South, which is something that you touched on earlier. What support would enable them to participate more effectively in multilateral organizations?
Great, thanks for that handoff again, Emily. I think the most direct answer is, and this might be crazy, but there has to be a stronger push for flexible funding, both for youth organizations and for individual youth advocates. And this is not the warmest concept, I believe, for most institutions. There is always emphasis on reporting, emphasis on transparency, more heavily on the side of the youth organizations or youth advocates applying for funding. And that in its own, you know, has its own set of barriers. So I won't touch on that too much, but just to put that on the table, because now there is a lot of attention on youth participation, but not enough attention on what makes this participation possible. You know, and it's one thing to say that youth organizations are asked to join consultations, submit inputs, attend meetings, even mobilize their communities, mobilize their audiences, and produce knowledge reports, thought pieces, op-eds, but they are often expected to do all of this on a volunteer basis or with little to no core support capacity support, and other levels of support as well. So for youth organizations from the Global South, I will say this makes, this whole thing is even more difficult. Participation in multilateral spaces, number one, asks of you to have the capacity to speak in a language that is detectable, honored, and legitimized by the Global North. It is also about having the resources to show up. You have to prepare. You have to buy a different set of adapters to plug your laptop in. You have to buy medicine. You have to, and also understand the process. Stay engaged. Not have issues financially for you to smoothly work on site. Not worry about where you will buy lunch. To have the cheapest option for it. And have the means to go home and follow through on whatever commitments that you made in session. So when we talk about support, I would name a few things. First, flexible and, if at all possible, long-term funding. Many youth organizations are operating on project-based grants, short-term volunteer labor, or reimbursement systems, which is great, but that only works if you already have the money up front as an organization or even as an individual, right? So institutions need to fund the quote unquote trivial and miscellaneous parts. They're not miscellaneous, they're super necessary parts of organizing. Coordination, travel support, obviously, but transportation from my home to the airport, which is an hour away. And for some people, they have to go to a different city just so they can have access to an international airport. Like getting the funds for like requesting for documents, or even translation. Young people sometimes do not understand conversation, so they don't get to be part of it. So for the more underserved young people who want to attend anything within the realm of multilateralism, it gets expensive. And I will call a spade a spade. It can be humiliating at times. I have had colleagues who have requested support from me because they did not have the money to request for documents, or they don't have a bank. Their country does not allow them to open a bank because of XYZ reasons, because of gender, because of class, because of lack of proof of whatever. Invitation letters are delayed or not prioritized, and it's a big reminder to institutions that Global South people have quite weak passports. We need early strong invitation letters that also come with accommodation and travel proof, because they won't accept our visa applications. We don't already have that. Per diems before travel, before, not after, not during. Where will we eat? How will we pay for the transport to that venue? Visa facilitation also, if there's any way that could be provided for. So young people go through all of this, by the way, often without compensation for labor. So this is not sustainable. It also creates inequality because only young people with financial security can afford to keep participating. Some of my colleagues, I've only seen them once, because sometimes it's a one and done thing. But then for some people who get to attend the other meeting and the next event and to go to the next consultation, just because they have financial capacity to do it. So honoraria, stipends, consultancy arrangements, paid coordination roles, I really want multilateral institutions to see them not as luxuries or something that is to be earned. They are safeguards against a crumbling sectoral memory. So many of us are having to exit the space because we simply cannot afford to stay in the space. So every person who has come in and given their inputs and have contributed to something, they have had to exit, and their backgrounds, their perspectives exit along with them. One would hope that we get to, give a lasting legacy, create something. Some of us don't. Some of us can't. Some of us have to leave because we have younger siblings to support, because we have families to feed. So that, and then there's also the topic of language, Multilateral institutions often say they are open, but the process is difficult to access if documents are only in technical English. Meetings happen during inaccessible hours. Platforms are not disability inclusive. So in this conversation of support, we must include the things that are inconvenient, because development is not convenient. You have to think about interpretation, plain language briefers, accessible formats, regional consultations, realistic timelines for input, funding for the most basic parts of participation. So the support also is not needed only financial, though it is central. It is also structural. We need to redesign participation so that it does not only reward only the most privileged, mobile, English-speaking, well-connected young people. So if multilateral institutions want young people to participate effectively, they have to move beyond inviting youth into spaces, because sometimes those spaces weren't even built for them in the first place. The institutions need to change the conditions of access itself. So thank you for that, and just welcoming Pratik Singh to the webinar too.
Thanks very much, Oni. Yeah, you made many really useful points, I think, about financing and the practical necessities for youth participation. Um, I would also like to welcome you, Prathit, to the conversation. Thanks so much for joining us. And I'd like to bring you in, if that's okay, about these structural barriers that we're talking about for youth participation. And so we often hear that mandatory youth quotas are a solution to participation issues. In your view, what changes would move beyond symbolic inclusion to give youth more of a voice in institutional settings?
Thank you so much, Samuel, and apologies to colleagues for joining the discussion a little late, but such an interesting moment to join this conversation right in the middle of discussing the institutional implications as well. Just thinking about how we approach youth participation in itself. And I'd like to use this platform to also think about challenging this very approach that we use towards youth participation, because in the current sort of institutional setting, we tend to think about youth participation from a very deliberative, democratic sort of aspect of accumulating numbers and inviting participation on one hand. And therefore, much of the models of youth participation that then come into being do not represent what young people have carried off through movements, through connections. We fail to realize that young people often operate through existing constituencies. So much of the youth movements that I've been studying, for instance, are Gen Z youth movements, on the ground. So in countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, Madagascar, Kenya, Tanzania, young people are not operating in and of by themselves, as organizations often do. They're operating in an entire, constituency with their own networks, using the different varied networks that, their constituencies have to bring. And therefore, in looking at youth participation, and when we limit them to numbers through quotas, through bringing in, this and this number of young people in a particular advisory board or a governance board, the whole point of capturing the genuine, most authentic voices of young people then becomes limited, because we limit the participation to numbers, we fail to see beyond the numbers, and therefore we also perhaps fail to capture voices that would be able to represent the constituencies that young people come from. And with that comes, therefore, the emphasis to perhaps restructure the way that we look at youth participation itself, to move beyond looking at youth participation in one-off, inviting to sit on panels and boards in so and so numbers, speaking and then going back, but more towards capturing the constituency-based approach, to capture how young people have been operating with their constituencies, to build capacities with these constituencies to engage with the platforms in the first place, to tell them what the platform is about in the first place, and then once that has been done, to then sort of try to also get in a dialogue with these constituencies as to who would be the best representation from within their networks to sit on so and so platform or so and so sort of multilateral setting. And therefore, if we start if we turn the way around thinking youth participation from numbers to thinking youth participation as an approach to constituencies, that is when we can really think about capturing the authentic voices and the authentic lived experiences of young people, because that's where the real representational element of young people comes in, rather than thinking about numbers and also siloing young people from their different constituencies and expecting them to just represent sort of, their one voice. It's not the one voice, it's the voice of constituencies of young people who've been on ground that should be represented, especially in context of multilateralism and global governance.
Thanks very much, Prathid. Yeah, I think this is a crucial point. The differences between youth constituencies, especially from a wide variety of countries where, as you mentioned, the recent Gen Z movements in countries from Nepal to Tanzania have had a huge impact on political events, and so it's difficult, and it's important to move beyond these quotas, as we were mentioning. So. Emily, would like to bring you back to the conversation as well. In your view, what practical steps could prioritize youth interests in institutional decision making?
Yes, thank you, Samuel, and also, yes, welcome, Prati, to the conversation, and thank you for your intervention. And I think, again, as first step, I really need to echo again what Oni was saying about creating the financial institutions and creating flexible funding, because I've also seen that in our work in terms of wanting to bring representatives from chapters in global south countries to events, to conferences, and in general to, engagement opportunities, and just not being able to do that because the grant would not provide for that. And it would let me cover my travel fees, but not that of the chapter representatives. So I think a lot needs to be discussed about how we design funding opportunities and how we design funding grants, and in general about access networks and financial institutions opportunities. I think that is a huge part of what needs to change or what needs to be considered differently. And I'm actually really glad that Pratit is here from Interpeace, because I think Interpeace has done a very good job at doing this for the CISO UN Peacebuilding Dialogue, which I think you are co-convening, co-hosting, which I attended 2024 once, and I was really struck by how many young people were in this room and how there was a conscious effort in the application process to make sure that there was a significant share of young people attending, or to give them priority, and also to provide them with funding to come to New York. I mean, this was before visa requirements changed, so I think now it's also moved to Geneva, but also to just create a space and an opportunity, not only for engagement between civil society and the UN, but also there was a conscious effort to bring peace builders from the global south to New York to give them the ability to talk to key stakeholders also in government, and to engage with the permanent representations that will be crucial in actually carrying forward and negotiating and arguing for specific positions and carrying forward civil society recommendations. So I think this kind of access is really valuable to political stakeholders, and to also provide the financing for that, because that, again, as we've spoken about beforehand, often is only available to larger NGOs, to often Western NGOs, and to those who have the infrastructure, who have the funding grants to support for this kind of travel, for this kind of advocacy. And I think it's great that there is a concerted effort within the CSO sort of dialogue to also create a platform and a dialogue for exchange. So I think, in terms of practical steps, I think multilateral organizations really need to recognize that they can play this convening role and that they need to create the space for dialogues, but also that it's not enough to just expect people to apply to attend or, to sign up for something, but you need to actually support them financially, logistically to get them into the room, and it needs to be important enough. And I think coming from an anti-corruption perspective, so yeah, working in an anti-corruption NGO, I think there's also one thing when it comes to maybe more in-country programs, but also, yeah, multilateral engagements that are sort of multi-stakeholder engagements. I think we need to stop taking the inclusion of young people for granted, or we need to stop looking at it as non-conditional, because especially in country contexts where there is a highly corrupt government and there is, yeah, entrenched corruption and a lot of injustice is created by that. A lot of the time, especially young people, refuse to work together with the government, and I think there's a legitimate reason for that. You know, there's a legitimate distrust, and I think we can't just expect them to look past that for the sake of doing a multi-stakeholder consultation. Like, you do need to look at the reasons why, especially when there is corruption involved, why young people don't want to cooperate or they don't trust the government, and also working on, you know, ensuring that there's trustworthiness and that there's a reason, well, to take serious reasons of young people to not want to engage with certain processes, but also creating a space that is safe for them, and that is trustworthy. I think that's also something that, yeah, just requires to be more of a priority.
Thanks a lot, Emily, for your comments. Yeah, I think once again the costs of participation, especially for attendees from the global south, is extremely difficult, and I think this is clearly one of the main barriers from what you've all mentioned. But also, I like the idea of making youth participation more conditional, and states having to show a certain level of commitment and enabling youth participation by making it safer. So thanks for that as well. So let's move back onto you, Prathid. I think we've seen with some youth-led movements, such as those working on climate issues, for instance, they've been particularly successful at impacting institutional agendas. So what lessons do you think youth-led movements could strengthen youth participation more broadly in multilateral institutions?
Thank you for that very sort of important question, especially at this moment, given that, you know, with wide acknowledgement that the multilateralism in itself, the institutions have been in a moment of crisis with the lack of funding, with the lack of with questions over trust, and with the questions over whether they've been really able to capture the lived realities of people around the world, especially young people. And of course, you know, towards the later half, I could also cover that and say that, you know, this very moment of crisis could also be a moment of opportunity over all the different problems that young people have been facing in the context of representation in multilateralism. But more importantly, from the youth movements, of course, there is three things that stand out. First is this element of constituency-based engagement, that young people increasingly feel that they're not represented or they're not heard within the multilateral setup, primarily because often so far the existing practices of engaging with young people have been limited and very restricted to inviting sort of, you know, one section or one sort of, you know, a particular identity of a young person who, you know, very inherently there is an understanding that wouldn't be too disruptive within the multilateral, you know, fora, and inviting them from, you know, some part of the world for a one-off engagement, having them speak on the panel, and then sending them back with all the little budget that is allocated to it, which has been the existing practice, which is sort of very problematic, because in doing so, you're not only losing in capturing the more authentic voices of young people, the more lived realities of young people, but we're also sort of in the process losing the very point of engaging youth voices. You know, the whole point of engaging youth voices is to have genuine representation, to have critical representation in the form where, you know, the more uncomfortable opinions and voices are expressed by some of the youth voices through the lived realities that they're living through, be it in the peace building context, context, be it in the context of conversations around disarmament. We have a excellent youth peace and security agenda, which still, is rolling out. In some parts, it's done excellently, but some parts of it are yet to be implemented, particularly nationally, right? So, the whole point of remodeling this youth participation and the youth movements currently are excellent representation and excellent narratives into why we need to reform the current ways of engagement around multilateralism and youth engagement. Second, of course, is the lived realities of young people, in the current forms again. And as the different youth movements show around the world, climate movements or be it democracy-based movements, they very clearly demonstrated that, their lived realities are increasingly not being captured by things and procedures that have been captured in the multilateral space. I recently wrote, not too recently, in fact, about half a year ago, I wrote this paper with collectively with young people from Nepal, Bangladesh, Nigeria, in how they thought that the right to a clean, healthy environment, particularly also which was then extended to children, was very much a construct or an idea that was centered to a classic European image of a middle-class European child, right? So there is this disorientation towards the very identity of a young person and how multilateral institutions, particularly those based in the West, have been capturing this identity. And this overlap of identity is primarily springing around the lived realities, because these lived realities are not very well captured by multilateral institutions in their current way of engagement, which therefore reinforces the need to engage with young people through a more constituency-based strategy and a more structured way of engagement. And the third, of course, a very related and a strong element is the visibility, is that the multilateral institutions currently are not being able to successfully give visibility to these youth movements that have been actively leading. At COPs, we have been able to set up child and youth pavilions, but these are at the end of the day side pavilions. They have no stake in decisions that are being taken by diplomats in the main decision rooms. They're only restricted to side events. And this is not just the case for COPs, this is the case for most discussions that we have. And this was also very much the driving factor behind the mandate that I have with the Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland in studying Gen Z movements, is that in spaces like Geneva and New York, we're constantly thinking and reflecting around democratic backsliding, which is an important discussion, and not to say that those are not important discussions, but at the same time we forget to take examples and strong narratives in democracy emerging from youth movements from around the world, which is almost a global factors now. But how often do we actually talk about it? So all of these are messages that we take forward from across youth movements in climate, in democracy, in social justice spheres that young people have been organizing it. But all of this to say that the model of youth participation that existing multilateral approaches have are set and are quite loaded with a particular form of engagement and a particular identity of youth that they've formed, which needs to be changed with the considerations of constituency-based engagement and with the considerations of decolonization, which becomes then two pillars of thinking about a new youth engagement strategy for multilateral institutions in the coming time, and as we think about the reform of multilateralism and therefore the reimagination of global governance.
Thanks very much, Prathit. That's very fascinating what you're talking about, and I like the idea of decolonizing the concept of youth and restructuring the youth participation as a whole in these international organizations. But it's also great to hear about the impact that youth movements have been having across the world in different situations at the COPs as well, but they're still outside of the decision-making process, which is obviously frustrating. But let's think about now, let's move on to issues concerning reform, maybe the future of youth participation and strategies for youth moving forward. So I wanted to move back to you, Oni, about this. Do you see any realistic openings for reform in the next 1 to 2 years on youth participation? Which multilateral bodies or processes do you feel are most ready for change, if any?
Definitely. I thank you, all three of you. And, Emily pointed out something super important on trust. So I want to lead with that. I believe that trust between institutions, member states, and of course, the broader, but even more important, civil society and stakeholder constituencies. These are what makes or break democratic governance. And at the end of the day, cooperation is about democratic processes still. So I think as people who work in development, and civil society, we all at a certain point cross an uncomfortable balance between being critical of institutions and still choosing to engage with them and trying to keep faith in them. And especially now, as Pratit has also mentioned, multilateralism is experiencing this massive and quite frankly unignorable shifts, including possible mergers that would affect structures, mandates, and financial allocations previously fought for by CSOs, by the very CSOs that will be impacted, not in the best way. Hopefully that is avoidable. But let me direct my response to your questions. For me, the first opening is an environmental multilateralism. I feel like in all the conversations that we are steering, the topic of climate is really important because we really are coming to we've gone over the tipping point, and so conversations right now, we're circling on AI, we're circling also on peace and security, we're circling also on participation, et cetera, et cetera. I as a part of the children youth major group to UNEP, I just want to have this point of intervention. Environmentalism is at an all-time red warning right now. Processes connected to UNEP, UN Environment Assembly, climate, chemicals, plastics, biodiversity, pollution. These are all especially important because young people are already highly mobilized in these spaces. So there are existing youth constituencies, major groups, advisory mechanisms, campaigns that institutions can build from. Now, the infrastructure is not perfect, but it exists. And as long as it exists, we have the opportunity to change them for the better. In the UNEP space, for example, there is already a recognized role for major groups and stakeholders. We're part of that. We are that. So CYMG has been able to engage young people across different environmental processes around the world. But the reform needed is to make this engagement more predictable and more influential, not in a way that, all of us as environmentalists are wondering, okay, where can we next do the next intervention? Where is the next opportunity to do this? Where else can we get to talk to this minister and that person? So what I'm saying is young people should not have to fight every time for speaking slots, for badges, access to documents, access to meeting rooms, meaningful inclusion and consultations. These should be built into the process. I think first and foremost, it's like half of the battle. Just getting there, finding an opportunity, finding a freaking Google form, that's half the battle. And then there's also opening around the follow-up to major global commitments on youth. A year ago, I was in Kenya for the UN Environmental Assembly, and we fought really hard for the Children and Youth Resolution. And this is the same thing in parallel to all other constituencies and the same structures that my colleagues are also part of. Many institutions now publicly recognize youth as partners in implementation, not only as beneficiaries, which is great, but this also creates a window to ask, if young people are partners, then where is the funding? Where is the seat in the coordination mechanism? Where is the reporting requirement to us, not us to them? Where is the evidence that these youth recommendations shape the outcome? I have the great opportunity to write the Global Youth Declaration, and it is my responsibility, especially in the upcoming annual meeting on the Committee of Permanent Representatives, to ask that to the permanent representatives. And I think in the next 1 to 2 years, this is important because institutions are and should be under pressure to show that participation is not just performative. There is growing fatigue among young people, as all of us mentioned earlier. Many youth advocates have spent years attending consultations where the same issues are raised again and again. Emily said it, Prati said it, I said it, a bunch of us already said it. There's lack of funding, lack of access, lack of feedback, lack of power. Institutions cannot keep asking young people to repeat the diagnosis without changing the system. They keep asking us, what can we do for you? We told you. In over 500 inches of documentation reports and interventions and resolutions and recommendations. The third opening, and this is something Emily mentioned as well, should be at the regional level. Sometimes global processes definitely are too rigid, aside from, inaccessible, too diplomatic. They're also too slow sometimes. You could attend a session that could extend well into 11 p.m. and some member states will actually raise their hands and ask, can we postpone this to tomorrow because our delegation would like to rest? So perhaps a strengthened regional institutional mechanism, regional UN offices can be more flexible and inclusive. They can pilot better models of youth participation, regional youth advisory boards with actual mandates and actual coordination with the member states within that region, funded youth delegates, multilingual consultations. Once more, very important that the people who get to speak are not just the people who can speak one language. Youth-led monitoring, monitoring and evaluation, right? And direct links between youth inputs and policy outcomes, which is incredibly weak, and I will call it that. These regional mechanisms can then create the pressure upward. So I also think development and philanthropy spaces are ready for change, particularly those that already work with youth-led organizations. Funders and multilateral partners are beginning to understand that youth participation cannot survive on volunteerism alone. It is the most exhausting note that we have been playing over and over again. If they want young people to contribute seriously, sustainably, and meaningfully, they need to resource youth organizations. That means flexible funding, as we talked about, support, travel support, compensation, and safeguarding. A lot of young people can definitely be exposed to a lot of exploitation and unsafe practices when they are in rooms where the big people are at. But I want to be careful. I don't think reform will happen automatically, obviously. Institutions often adopt the language of inclusion much faster than they are able to change in practice. So they can create youth panels and advisory groups without actually changing who holds the power. They can celebrate youth leadership while still expecting unpaid labor. They can invite young people to speak while excluding them from, the conversations that matter on the decision-making level. So I want to wrap this in saying that the realistic opening is not simply that institutions are ready. I think we're past that. The opening is that young people and civil society have become much clearer and assertive about what meaningful participation requires. We are no longer asking to be included. We are asking for funding. We are asking for accountability, access to information, decision-making power, and protection against tokenism. So that is a more mature demand. And I will say it is a direct result from all the empowerment initiatives that we as a society have been investing in for our young people, for us, for the people in this room and in this Zoom meeting and when tuning in live. So for me, reform in the next 1 to 2 years should focus on practical changes, right? Institutions should create minimum standards as consulted with young people for young people's participation. They should fund youth constituencies properly. They should have youth constituencies. They should provide travel and visa support early, making sure that they have in mind those from the global south need a lot more documents than the rest of the world. They should compensate youth labor. They should publish feedback on how youth inputs were used as an accountability effort, and they should include young people in implementation and monitoring, not only consultation. So yes, I see openings, but I would frame them less as opportunities given by institutions. I see them more as pressure created by young people, youth organizations, and civil society. So the role of institutions now is to decide whether they will absorb that pressure symbolically or respond to it structurally.
Thank you so much, Oni. Yeah, you've given us a lot to think about with in terms of reform, and I think it's great that youth input has created this pressure to create a possibility for reforms and forcing hopefully these institutions to respond effectively and to create these spaces that are needed and these practical changes that are completely fundamental. I mean, funding youth labor, visa participation, these are the basics. And I think that um, an issue is potentially a lack of institutional memory sometimes that people, there's also a revolving door in these institutions. People don't remember that these are the fundamentals that they need to take care of. But anyway, thanks so much for that. And let's I'd like to ask you, Emily, as well about this. I mean, what do you think needs to change for youth participation to become a priority concern for major stakeholders within these multilateral institutions?
Um, I think, to be honest, one of my main takeaways also from this conversation is going to be that it needs a fundamental shift in mindset or approach. And I mean, I think as we've all said in the webinar, we need to move beyond youth inclusion just being a tick box exercise and being tokenistic. But I think there needs to be a true recognition of the necessity and actually the value that it brings to really consider the lived realities of young people across the world and the complexities in that and the differences between those lived realities and the needs of young generations. Because I think a lot of the time, you know, as young people voice their needs, what politicians at national level, regional level, you know, across the board will say is like, oh, you'll understand this when you're my age, or like if you get older and you gain perspective, then, you know, your perception is going to change. But I do really think we need to move away from this mindset and these kind of responses because young people have needs now. They are valid and they need to be heard and they need to be responded to. And yeah, I think as Oni said, you know, young people are no longer willing to ask for inclusion if they know that it's tokenistic and inclusion on its own or just, you know, a seat at the table is not enough. It needs to go somewhere, it needs to have impact and it needs to be funded. And I think again, coming from working in the anti-corruption space, this is also really interesting because we mentioned, I think Pratit earlier, and you also, Samuel, mentioned the protests, where young people have really been driving change. And a lot of that, again, is also young people reacting to corrupt leaders, challenging corrupt leadership, challenging entrenched corrupt systems and wanting a better life for themselves and voicing their frustration very clearly and very effectively. And I think there's a lot of power within these movements that is underestimated. And I think that, yeah, this is something we can definitely learn from. And in general, I think multilateral institutions need to understand that any initiative that they want to shape needs to be responsive to the needs of young people and needs to also to be effective in any way and sustainable in the long term. Make an impact needs to listen to from the beginning, and yeah, as Oni I think said previously, not just at some point 2 years down the line. No, from the inception of a project, from the inception of a policy, from right from the beginning, needs to substantially listen to what the needs and the realities of young people are right now. Yeah, I'll leave it here. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Emily. Yeah, a shift in approach and listening to the needs of young people is absolutely what's needed. And I think they bring a lot of urgency, don't they? Which is crucial, especially when it comes to issues, well, varied issues, but especially around the climate crisis, which couldn't be more urgent. And so thanks a lot for bringing that up. And yeah, let's move on to you, Pratit. So how can youth movements build power in multilateral institutions without being co-opted by state actors, which are pursuing their own geopolitical agendas? What's your view on that?
That's a very interesting question, given the number of times that it comes up within conversations around my own work with young people, given the considerations of safeguarding and the duty of care. But importantly, I think, and if I may just, continue the discussions that were sort of, plugged by Oni and Emily here, was that, and again, going back to this idea of this moment for multilateralism, of being in a moment of crisis, being in a moment of reflection around reform. And this becomes exact moment to not only challenge sort of existing practices from the inside, but also begin questions from the outside. And when I say the outside, I look at the existing multilateral ecosystems, such as Geneva and New York. I live in Geneva and I work here, and it's been close to 3 years since I've been here. One thing that has stood out to me in the way that the city sort of and of course the city has had an ecosystem of multilateralism, some of the oldest actors in diplomacy, being the seat of the United Nations. But one crucial factor you'll see is that there are lobbies. There's lobbies with the states with their permanent representations. There's lobbies around private actors with their sort of philanthropic organizations that have their own sort of organized lobbies. There's platforms like the environmental hub. There's the Geneva Cities Hub that has given a considerable spaces for these actors to come together and push as a collective voice, as a collective lobby for considerable change. What strikes to me is that currently there is no such lobby or an organized constituency of young people which convenes these sort of pre-existing constituencies globally within an ecosystem like International Geneva or even New York for that matter. Most of the approaches have been very restricted institutionally. They've sort of tried to embed the interests of young people very in an institutional setting, be it voices emerging from within the UN or other organizations in and around the multilateral ecosystems. And I can speak for Geneva here, or they've relied on one-off models of participation. What remains significantly absent is this lobby or this hub for young people to come together to exchange in an organized way, and then to organize themselves as a constituency which has a capacity to lobby, to mobilize, to essentially work with actors as a collective constituency. And I know there's challenges surrounding, given the diversity of voices around young people themselves, given the diversity of ages and the definitions of youth around the world. However, these challenges can have a way of mitigation with the convening power that cities like Geneva particularly have. And therefore, one of the things that I've been working on together with the Graduate Institute and Geneva Policy Outlook is towards building a Geneva Youth Hub, which brings together these pre-existing constituencies of young people from around the world to convene them in a space like International Geneva, and therefore give them this space to mobilize themselves, to mobilize, actors around International Geneva. And it doesn't need to be, everyone coming and getting on a plane and coming to Geneva. Here's where we leverage exactly when we leverage the digital ways of organizing. Increasingly around the world, young people have been taking on digital ways of organizing and mobilizing, not only to express their opinions, but now even to elect interim governments, right? If you look at what happened in Nepal, if you look at discussions around Gen Z movements in Madagascar, platforms like Discord have been used actively to mobilize as a political sort of group within national context. Why can't this be done in the international context? And why can't young people from these constituencies be sort of given that those digital tools and sort of mobilized to come together as a distinct lobby to then have that capacity to challenge not only the pre-existing lobby of the states, but also have a significant presence within the multilateral system. And that's what drives me really to think about, here's what the transformative approach could come from, in a moment of crisis. And of course, when we think about reforms of multilateralism, we restrict ourselves to thinking about the reforms that can emerge within the UN, right? However, and here's where I talk about the larger ecosystem of multilateralism and the push for really bringing youth inclusion, it could come from outside of traditional structures. It's just about, the capacity and the ability to mobilize and really engage with these forces externally to be able to then influence the force internally as well, right? And that is only possible at this moment, when we are constantly thinking about how to reform internally, but also take into account external ecosystems and forces within the multilateral architecture. And therefore, I feel that, for youth movements, what really matters in exercising the influence that is needed right now is that convening power in a space that matters and a space that can really empower them in influencing decision making. That space might not emerge from the inside of traditional multilateral architectures, given how much driven they are by the power holders of the state. And therefore, the responses then might come from the outside through creating these new hubs and creating these new collaborative and convening spaces and giving youth constituencies around the world this convening space to be able to come together and really mobilize by themselves to push for positive changes in global governance. And that, I believe, would be key not only for youth movements to bypass the existing restrictions that they're facing in the national context, but also to be able to think about a long-term constructive and institutional change that comes in and is driven from outside the traditional structures that is very much needed at this moment in time.
Thanks very much, Pratit. And I think it's an important point, the convening power of different places and cities. And the Geneva Youth Hub sounds like a really exciting, innovative idea. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. And yes, well, it is a moment in a sense for reform. And I think that different organizations and states are aware of that. And that's why this is also an interesting conversation to have now. Um, let's now kind of move on to some concluding points from all our panelists. Yeah, I mean, you can kind of choose more or less what you'd like to mention, but I guess an idea could be that if you're advising a young person from the global south, looking to have an impact at a global institution today, what advice would you give them? And also more generally, perhaps what could youth-led movements and civil society focus on moving forward? So maybe we could start with you, Arnie. Would that work?
Yes. No worries. For young people from the global south, especially, I would say do not underestimate the knowledge that comes from lived experiences. Global institutions often value technical language, obviously, but communities already know what harm, what resilience, and what justice looks like in practice. So the task is not to sound like institutions. The task is to make institutions listen better. I think also just having the audacity to say the important things. Disadvantaged young people cannot always be the perfect victims of circumstances. We cannot, at every stage of our activism, be grateful 100% towards institutions that do show support. Sometimes we experience their failures. And sometimes we are disappointed by them, and we can even be betrayed by institutions that were originally built to protect us. We should allow ourselves to remember and keep score these negligences and delinquencies, which, if you want to make it sound fancier, hold them accountable for measurement and evaluation. But I will personally stick with keeping score. And as a final advice, I hope youth organizations and young people keep applying to things. That's how I started, and that's how I'm able to even keep going in the first place for grants, fellowships, consultations, advisory roles, and speaking opportunities for positions in, the rooms that, we say the rooms where the big decisions are made. And once you get your foot in the door, please make sure you're letting as many people in. I have done my fair share of Robin Hood type activism in ushering peers into rooms they didn't have a quote unquote official badge for. But I want to say this is our duty to our generation. We are bound by duty as youth leaders to share information, to recommend others, to translate these processes that are often made unnecessarily complicated. It is our duty to open these doors, even if, the institutions say we only have 5 badges. We only have this and that. We only have, do you have 20 people? Because that's all we can account for. And I'm going to say, yeah, I have 20 and I have 10 more in the back, just in the clown car waiting for, a little window of opportunity. I hope we all follow through in our social mandate to make the room less intimidating for the next young person who enters it. We won't stay young forever. And I promise you, there are few things as magical as seeing the next generation after you becoming more forceful, more influential, and seeing younger leaders create a platform that is just so much better than how you first found it. So that would be it for me.
Thanks very much. Emily, would you like to go next, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. I think everything's pretty much already been said. But I think I would say recognize your power. This system is built around trust. It relies on your trust, but that trust needs to be built, and you can demand this from these institutions that were built to serve you. That is their mandate. And you can demand better from them, even if you at the same time want them to do things for you. And yes, it's for them to earn your trust. It's not something that is a given. And I think moving forward, especially during times of democratic backsliding and very, very much change and transformation of global governance, but also national governance. I think that's a governance that's something to remind yourself of. And youth organizations, young people make up such a huge share of the population, which I think we forget about a lot of the time. But we have so much power coming together, and that means like we don't need to bow down in that sense to people making the rules. Like we can demand better from them. Definitely. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Emily. That's very, very hopeful. And moving on to you, Prati, do you have some final comments as well?
Well, I wouldn't go as far to say an advice to young people of the global south, particularly because young people from the global south do not need advice, and the past few years have been just a testimony to that. The changes, political changes in Nepal, in Bangladesh, upcoming in Kenya, in Madagascar. They did not need any advice for creating changes that they did nationally and in their national context. So why should they need advice when the same comes to the international context? In fact, I would go as far to say that the international context should take advice in informing its decisions better from these examples of what the change that young people have been leading at a national level. I would say, though, if I had to, that there is a power in mobilizing, and there is a power in doing so internationally, which has not immediate benefits, but benefits that rest more with creating a stronger institutional change that can be brought about more effectively when the same discussions are brought from national to an international level. And therefore, my advice wouldn't be to young people from the global south. My advice would be to stakeholders in the global north, if we are taking that construct, and in the global architectures and centers of power, such as where the traditional seats of multilateralism are, to be able to convene these young people, to be able to mobilize these young people, would be my prime advice for these reforming institutions. Otherwise, it's only a question for their relevance. Youth movements will go on and continue creating changes as they have been. What would be challenging is the relevance of multilateral institutions if they do not listen, and if they do not, if they do not pay attention to what young people have been doing. So it is, in fact, a moment for multilateral institutions and a moment of reform to learn from young people and to incorporate their discourses in the work and the day-to-day operations that they do at an international level, rather than the other way around. So my message primarily would therefore be to the traditional architectures of multilateralism, to be more receptive and to do so more articulately, actively, and with an approach that is more representative than it currently is. Otherwise, there would be bigger challenges, even bigger challenges to legitimacy and trust than there currently are.
Thanks very much, Pratit. Yeah, the question is the institutions need to make themselves relevant by listening to youth, young people's voices. That's very true. Well, thanks a lot to all three panelists for your final remarks. We have some time left for questions, so if attendees want to ask some questions to our panelists, feel free to write it in the Q&A box here. But I already see there's a question waiting for us, so we can perhaps move on to that one. It's from Mohammed Bello Abdul Fattah, and the question is, many institutions speak about youth inclusion, but young people are often consulted without being involved in actual decision making. What practical mechanisms have you seen that successfully move youth participation from consultation to real influence within multilateral institutions? Well, that's a very good question. Does anyone from the panelists want to take that on?
I mean, I can probably kick us off.
Sure.
I think one good thing, so I can link this to the local perspective of the Philippines. The people of the Philippines actually sued. It was a landmark legal case against major oil company for quote unquote like propelling the climate catastrophe with knowledge of the risks, et cetera, et cetera. It's the first civil claim to directly link the climate impacts of oil and gas companies to deaths and personal injury. And this was filed in December 2025. Coincidentally, this was also the time of convening for the UN Environment Assembly. And so when I got the opportunity to attend, and we were working on all 16 resolutions as a major group during the formals, formal informals, et cetera, and in any convening, I had the opportunity to bring that into conversation. How do you reference local context and very, very valid case studies that happens in your countries or in your regions into multilateral institutions? And will I say that affected the outcome of the resolutions? Maybe I want to say what percent. But that is the importance of bringing in your local realities, your lived experiences. And if you are someone who is particularly within the field of research, within the field of law, and that's something that you could contribute to conversations on any stage that you are in. These are important and also very, very influential cases you could bring forth in conversations. It is a basis. And if there's anything that multilateral institutions do, their main mandate is norm setting. And so when you get to have interventions that would influence the norm settings that they are able to create, makes a world of difference. If that's not super practical, I understand that, but it's something to think about if you're a professional in the field of that.
Thanks very much, Ani. Would someone else like to come in on this question?
If I may just quickly touch a little bit on two things that are quite instrumental in determining how influential participation for young people is. One is, of course, the political will. So you'll see within the multilateral architectures, there are some sort of organizations and institutions and departments which really take this as a matter of treating this as a side element and giving side events and pavilions without making sure that youth participation is representative. I find COP as an example of how this is done every year, that young people are given a side space without having a real impact in decision making. And of course, there's significant push coming from youth constituencies like Yango in changing that. But really, having and reaching that level of change is hindered primarily because of the lack of political will to be able to give that space to young people. But more importantly, I think there have been some sort of push that has come, particularly from some sides. And if I'm to use the example of the UN, if you looked at the UN special procedures, right, there has been a significant push in the past few months from the UN special procedures to be actually able to connect and have not just consultations, but also reflecting how these consultations have materialized for and what these consultations really represent. I had the honor of working alongside and together with the Institute for Inspiring Children's Futures in the University of Strathclyde to work with the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change to organize consultations for her report on food systems and climate change, but also more importantly to engage with young people to really capture their honest experiences and voices about how they feel about the intersection of food systems and climate change. That did not end there. Ultimately, the special rapporteur decided that this set of outcomes of the consultations would go as annex to her report, which was just launched last week at the Human Rights Council. Right. So there's moments where you really wonder about the will that exists within the political space of multilateral organization to engage with young people and the constituency of young people constructively. And then there are moments where you really see this drive to reflect very honestly and very in a more candid way about the need for young people to push for more accountability from within the institutions. And a lot of it has to do with institutional sort of space that is provided and the mandates that are provided, but also much more of it has to do with garnering the political will to be able to do so.
Thanks very much.
I can
Yeah,
I can
go.
just quickly add, I think I said this at the beginning, but yeah, I think access to negotiation spaces is a huge game changer, makes a huge difference. And yeah, I can only judge that from the UNCAC space, but there is the possibility to include civil society delegates to a government delegation, because the negotiations are not per se open to civil society, and within that there's also the possibility to include young voices, which I think is rarely done at this point, but it is an opportunity. And that is really because, yeah, coming back to the norm setting element of multilateral institutions, which I think is their main function and maybe the most powerful, because then that sets precedent of how you can implement these norms at the national level. So it gives you ammunition to advocate at the national level. I think that is something that needs to be explored more. And for governments, really, I think they have to open up the space. Like, they have to bring in young people. They have to acknowledge again their expertise and what they have to bring to the table in negotiations and include them. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, all of you, for your comments on this. We have one last question. We've got a couple of minutes left. So the question is from Aziza Kojaeva. And the question is, you have talked a lot about what institutions should implement in order to include youth voices and perspectives and creating opportunities for young people to not only be included, but also actually participating and being important in the development and decision processing. But how can we as youth find such opportunities? How can we get a chance to actually take part in something truly meaningful? Would one of you like to respond to this?
I can go again first, just so mindful of time and all. I started as a grassroots activist. I started as a community organizer, and I want to say that being part of something truly meaningful doesn't necessarily have to start in the multilateral space. In fact, most of us will not start in the multilateral space. It is something that we kind of have to fight for, which is not the best. But then, when you want to start somewhere, it's something that you can create. Gathering is something wildly undervalued. Even just a group of 3, a group of 4, creating an organization, or even a group of people who think in the same way, and then you can create a project or create a social media platform or anything that could represent your values, your thoughts and opinions, but also more formally, I want to hearken what Emily said about putting pressure on governments. There is also collaboration with your governments, your local government units, or even something as very basic as, do you have a nearby center that you could go to? Are there volunteer opportunities in local communities? Gathering is a very effective way to sort of crawl to like higher forms of platforms and in terms of service. If you are someone very much so particularly interested in multilateral systems, you are able to join children youth major groups or to be part of networks like Civicus, actually, and to receive information, receive networks from there. I will say it is the responsibility of those institutions to make sure that as many people know about it. But until now, it's not enough to just have them online on a website or on a platform, because some young people don't have that at all. So there, I guess I just want to represent two levels of equally meaningful terms of service. You create something, you be part of something, both are meaningful and both can get you somewhere if you are shooting or vying for a space for negotiation or a space to get to a higher level of not higher level, but a broader and more global format of activism. Yes.
Thanks very much, Oni. And well, I think we're out of time now. So thank you all so much for participating, to the people listening in, for your questions. And a big thank you, especially to today's panelists, Oni, Emily, and Pratit, who really provided us with some crucial insights into the challenges and opportunities for strengthening youth participation in global governance. And I have to say, I really enjoyed this conversation. So have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you so much for having us, Simon.
Yes,
Of
thank
course.
you.
Thanks, guys.